Hi everyone. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the electric bass on the album and specifically the tune Manic. And I'm going to start with comping and editing. So just a little background. I've been playing the electric bass parts on this album, and when I was back in college and practicing 6 to 8 hours a day, I was pretty virtuosic. And since I've been composing for a bunch of years, my technique has gotten totally rusty. So for those of you that aren't naturally virtuosic players, this might be helpful in figuring out a strategy on how do you get something, because what I did was I wrote a really hard bass part, and I had to put it together in pieces. So here's how I did it, and then we'll kind of get into like the strategies I used to be able to accomplish this. I'm really happy with the results, and you'll get to hear bits and pieces. The one thing I did notice is, even though I hadn't played in a while, the ideas are there, and my brain still works fine. So I had to just basically, when I was recording, I would do multiple takes. I'd do like 3 or 4 takes of the same section of music. And I would just do it over and over again and record 3 or 4 takes until I got 3 or 4 good possibilities. And then once I was happy with that section, I'd move on to the next section and record things in pieces that way. So here's an example where I'm just going to play. I've got the bass soloed and I have no effects on it right now. So this is just direct input. And so this is just what I ended up with as my take one on my playlist. And I'll play just the solo part so you can hear what's there. And then we'll show you the other takes. Okay, so that's take one. Just to give you a perspective, this is with the rest of the band, so you can kind of hear how it fits. It's just mostly, it's syncopations, but sustained notes. So it's like on the beat and then anticipating a beat, on the beat, anticipating a beat. Right, so that's on the playlist. That's take one. Take two. Right, so that's take two. And I'm not playing it exactly the same way each time, which can be an issue with comping, and I'll get into that in a minute. This is take three. Right, so and those are the 3 takes that I ended up doing. I've got up to 8 different playlists here, but like I just kind of use it as an area for me to work. So it's not like I did 8 takes. I just did three takes of that section. So I don't know if you noticed, but everything's a little different. I'm basically around the same note, but sometimes I change octaves. Sometimes I'm doing left-hand techniques, like I'm doing a hammer, or I'm doing a lift or something like that. And I'm doing like different kinds of subtle nuances with the notes, which is naturally the way I like to play. It's very in the moment, and it's not like I'm not a machine where I'm like going to do it exactly the same way. So when it comes to comping, here's the way I approach it. I've done my 3 takes, and then I just listen with everything, and I listen for what the energy is and how the energy feels on each of those takes. And then for comping, I choose a couple things. Sometimes, like I think in take 2, my second note is softer. Right, so that second note is a little softer than, let's say, take 1. Right, so a little more attack on that second note. So I'm listening for all those micro nuances. Take 1 is more consistent for those 2 notes, but I'm listening in general to that section and listening for what sounds good to me with the band, as far as a performance that feels like it's tight. When it comes to the comping, I'm going to show you the comp part now. This is all from take one, but I might have nudged some things to be really tight with either the drums as they come in later or with the guitar, because the guitar is sort of the focal point of this part of the tune. So I just nudged things just a couple of microseconds, a couple of milliseconds here or there, just to kind of tighten up different phrases. So you'll see all these edits along the way. Basically, it's take one for those first two notes. And then if I just sort of move along, it's all take one, and I'm just nudging that take. When I get to bar 44, beat 4, I grab the note that I used from take 3. And then you can see there's no nudging here because I kind of got it more into a pocket there with the drums when the drums kicked in. So let me play you from the beginning of this section the comp to take. In this tune, there's a couple of different sections. There's this sort of bossa funky kind of section, but you can see there's a few nudges here and there, or I liked take 3 for about 2 bars, and then I went back to take 1. So I'm kind of flipping between take 1 and take 3. So that's one of the sections. There's kind of 3 groove sections or types of grooves in this whole tune. And then the stuff that was super challenging was the double time stuff. So you'll see a lot of edits as I'm trying to tighten things and grab what I feel are the best performances, which is what a comp is all about. You're going for a best overall performance. And I'm also doubling this Moog bass, but you'll also notice if I kind of scroll through here that I've got a couple of edits where I'm nudging some things around in the Moog bass. And that's because what I did was I focused on making sure the Moog bass was locked in to what the drums we're doing, because the drums aren't necessarily 100% on the grid. I'm listening for how things feel, and I'm just trying to make it sit in a good spot. It doesn't have to be like perfect at all, but it just has to feel right. So it's a combination of, and I've got my bass really loud right now, so if I put it back at its normal volume and just soloed both the electric bass and the Moog, so you can hear, I try to find a nice level where you hear the electric bass, you hear the Moog kind of even, and that's going to be part of the sound for that fast section. So here's the part edited, and you can hear how nutty it is. Right? So there's that. Now if I double it with the Moog bass, you can hear what that vibe is like. And now I'm going to play it with the track so you can kind of hear what it is in perspective of the whole mix. And you'll hear the bass louder than anything else right now, just because I want you to be able to hear that. So that's the second section. The third section is this sort of B flat, samba-y kind of groove. So I'll play it with the whole track. Right, so it's just in that cycle. It's like an 8-bar phrase that just keeps repeating for a while. So that's the third section. So if I just solo the bass part. Right, and it repeats. So it may sound like it's kind of the same, but there's all these syncopated anticipations that have to be really tight. In general, I think I was doing pretty good when I was doing my takes as far as the feel, but I just kind of picked and choose what I thought felt the best, and then I would just sort of nudge them so that they would lock in with the drums really well. So let me just give you the drum kit plus the bass in that section. So that, I think, sounds pretty good as far as a feel. And with comping, that's, especially for groove-oriented kinds of stuff, that's a big deal. Because you could be too surgical, and granted, this is very surgical. You could be too surgical on the comping, and then it starts to sound sterile. And I didn't want that. And also, I mentioned this earlier, when I do multiple takes, I don't play it exactly the same way each time. That allows me some choices when I get to the comping stage, because I might have done a little slide or a little lift or a hammer, or maybe changed my finger technique, because sometimes I'll play with my fingers closer to the fingerboard, which is a rounder sound. But I might, as I'm playing, and this is sort of an interesting thing, I think, with some players kind of keep their finger always in the same spot. But I tend to move around based on what I'm feeling in the moment. So if I want something that's got a little more mid-range and a little more brightness, or a little different kind of color, I'll start moving my fingers to a different location. So if I move my fingers close to the bridge pickup, it's going to be a brighter, more mid-rangey sound than if I have it close to the fingerboard. And I tend to do that naturally, and I just like the variation that creates in the performance. So because I do those variations when I'm doing takes, that makes it kind of fun when you're doing the comping, because you can pick and choose what you think is the best way to construct a comp that has a really great feel, but there's still stuff that's a little unpredictable as far as the kinds of choices the player makes as they're doing stuff. And it's a little different psychology than somebody that does 3 takes exactly the same way, and you're just trying to see what's the best version of that out of those different takes. With this method, it gives you a little more flexibility as far as the kinds of choices that you can do. That's the comping, editing kind of component. And most of the editing is just me kind of grabbing, and it's a combination. Sometimes I might grab stuff on a grid mode here, and I'll just kind of pick something that I'm going to grab and then move it around. But a lot of times I might flip it from the grid to the slip mode, and then I can kind of pick exactly what I want to grab and move it, because I'm looking for like a 0 point to start with, and then I might want to move things that way. So flipping between the grid mode and slip mode is just sort of a choice that I make as I'm going through things. You can notice that some of these look like they are very precise. Like right now, my grid is set at 16, but I think this was a 32nd note kind of thing when I did, or I might have set it for 64ths, right? And then when I did my crossfades, those were like 2 64th notes worth of crossfades. So depending on what I'm hearing, which is sort of what I key in on, like what kind of a crossfade I put in, how big it is. Sometimes I do micro crossfades on these edits because it just doesn't need anything more than that to get it to sound seamless and elegant, which is what I'm going for. So that's all the editing and comping kinds of things. Next is going to be like, what did I do as far as for electric bass? What did I do for things like EQ and compression and all that? So generally I'm using the two tools that I've been using on a lot of other stuff. So I'm using FabFilter on the electric bass. Notice that there's nothing, I'm not using a high pass filter where I do a shelf on the bottom. I'm keeping all of my low end right now on the FabFilter EQ. I just pulled back, there's a little muddiness happening around 495 hertz that I wanted to pull out. That helped clean up the bass in the whole mix. And then on top of that, there's some upper frequencies like around 2K and around 3600 where I kind of created a little bump, a couple of dB here. It's only like 3 dB at 3600 hertz. At the 2K part, I bumped that up about 6 dB, and that's more the finger, the character of the instrument and the attack of the notes. So I'll give you a bypass version of, I'll use this same section, the double time section, so you can kind of hear, because I play it kind of hard. Right, so that's no EQ. This is with this EQ. And you can see how it's, you know, a lot brighter on the attacks when I hit it hard, and I'm using a dynamic EQ on the 3.6K. I'm just bumping it up a little bit, like it's like literally 1.5 dB. As I play it harder, it gives it just a little more of that higher frequency. But I also want to point out this mid-range one. So I'm going to play it again, and I'll just disable the mid-range on and off. So this is disabled. Right, so it takes out some of the boxiness and the stuff that's making things a little muddier in the bass just by bumping that down. And it's just literally, the Q is at 2.1. I'm down 4 dB, which is not super extreme. And my frequency on this case was 495. You have to do like you do on the other videos where I talk about EQ and dialing in the subtractive EQ. You just scan through the frequencies until you find the area. You generally focus on particular range for certain things. Muddiness tends to be kind of in that 300 to 500 hertz range a lot of times. You focus on a general range, but then you just dial it in so it's really specific. So that's the FabFilter Pro Q. So it's just a little subtractive EQ to get rid of the mud, and some additive EQ to emphasize the attack transients of the notes to get more definition. I'm going to play it with the whole track so you can kind of hear when I disable this EQ what it does in the mix. Right, so that is with it in, and this is with it bypassed. Right, so you can tell the higher frequencies on the attack, it's much less. You don't really hear as much definition on the bass part with everything else that's going on. So that's the biggest bonus with how I did the additive EQ. And then that subtractive, getting rid of the mud, just makes a little room in the mix for other stuff, because there's like a whole other rhythm section. So the other plug is the same Lindell 80 series Neve 8080 plugin that I've been liking. On this one, there's a couple things that I did. On my EQ and filtering, I got nothing going on the very top. I've got nothing happening on this knob, nothing happening here. All I'm doing is I did my EQ on the FabFilter, and then I'm shelving here. So, and I want to show you a couple things on shelving. So right now I'm shelving at 14K on the upper end, so everything above 14K is shelved out. You know, I want that high sizzle from the cymbals and stuff to kind of be part of that high frequency stuff, and there's really not a lot frequency wise that's coming out at 14K. So I just put a really high shelf up just to make sure it's nice and clean up there. And then notice I'm on my low shelf, I've just have it at 45 hertz. If you recall on the Fab Filter, I got nothing happening on the low end as far as shelving out anything. But on the Lindell, I'm shelving out at 45. So I'm going to enable this so you can hear it. And it makes a difference. So I'll just bypass without the shelving, which is the only EQ stuff I got going on in this channel. So just taking out that 45 hertz and below, much cleaner in the mix, right? So I'm making room, because there's a kick drum down there too. So who gets that lower frequency space in the mix? I'm leaving it more for the kick. Now the one trick I was going to do is, what happens if I change how extreme I shelve the bottom, right? So if I take it at 70 instead of 45 hertz, it sounds a little different. It does thin out the bass a touch. But in some mixes, that might be the case. You might need to do that to make a little more room for that kick. In this case, I like 45, but there's something about 70 that's kind of interesting. So let me just play it right now. Everything's engaged. And okay, so this is with the low shelf at 45. So you can hear when I have the shelf at 70, you can still hear the bass cleanly, which is nice. But that sort of subby bottom end that's in between 45 hertz and 70, you can definitely hear it when I move it to 45 here. You can hear that range, and it makes it a little more subby. And that's a matter of taste. Do I like it or not? I haven't decided 100% yet. I may try different things. And one of the things that's nice about me adjusting, I've already got a saved version of this, and the compare button here within Pro Tools is nice. So I can play it with the 70 hertz shelf, and then just hit the compare button, and it'll flip back to the original 45 hertz shelf. That's kind of a nice way to kind of compare things out. So that's two EQ components. So this is literally just shelving only on the Lindell 80 series. And then the Fab Filter is doing some subtracting on the mud and some additive on the character of the bass. So those are those two. Now I'm doing something different on the electric bass than I've done previously with some of the other stuff, like on the drums. So let me go to that. So I'm using Neutron, which is our friends at Isotope. And, there's some cool stuff with the Isotope plugs that I really enjoy. A lot of these are like what I call a combination plugin. It's almost like a guitar bass stomp box where you can pick and choose a bunch of things and put them in an order, and then run a little chain of things. So there is some extra EQ going on in the Neutron. There's compression, and I'm doing the EQ after compression, and then there's also some exciter that I've added. On the compression, it's a very light compression. It's 1.5 to 1 ratio. This is a nice little plug-in as far as like how it makes things sound. So I'm going to bypass it first. You can hear it without anything on this same section. So you can hear it got way punchier, right? So the compression helps that a little bit. There's a little bit of gain that's been added. And then on top of that, it's just a light compression. So the idea is it just sort of brings the dynamic range in a little bit. Sometimes you don't need a lot. You don't need to smack it hard with like an 8 to 1 compression or anything like that. So that's the compression that I'm using in the Neutron. And then on the EQ, I'm just covering 2 areas. On the low end, about 92 hertz, doing a bump of about 4.5 dB, and it's a dynamic one. When I play it, I'll do some on and off stuff here. So I'm just going to disable. So this is without this added EQ component. Right, so that's definitely adding a lot more of the bass frequencies, getting it to pop even more. So there's that component. And then on the upper end, a little above, like close to 3.3K, I'm doing another gain, dynamic gain. So I'm definitely, it's like adding more on the high end. So this is without and then with. Here we go. That one's more subtle. You can barely hear it, but it just adds a little something as far as controlling the higher end. So that's the EQ. So we've got 2 additive EQ components in the Neutron, as well as my other 2. So I'm EQing in 3 different places. Part of it is just being very clear when you're EQing to, this was specifically in a similar range as I've got with the FabFilter Pro Q. But it's a slightly different frequency area, and it's doing something slightly different. So you're looking at this whole frequency band, right? This whole frequency band, and you're just trying to shape. There's something in the high end. I want to shape like a certain part of it a particular way, and then another part of it, I want to shape it a little differently. And it's just being very surgical and careful about what you're doing. Part of it's staying organized. Part of it's just listening and seeing what sounds good to you. And the third thing's the exciter. So this is a multi-band exciter, so it's using 3 different ranges where you kind of pick your frequency, 200 hertz to 6K, right? And that's doing a certain level of adding a little bit of the exciter, like 4.0, and then we're 3.3 on the low end, and on the high end, we're at 4.9. So we're adding a little more, and it's doing different things to those different frequency areas to kind of bring out different qualities. So this is with the exciter off and then on. This is in the mix, right? So let me just solo it and do the same thing so you can kind of hear the difference. And with it. So you can hear some of those upper mids kind of pop out a little bit more and creates a little more character. And it just overall makes it stick out in the mix a little better. Now keep in mind that I did that one 45 hertz shelf, 70 hertz shelf with the Lindell 80, but I've also, with my equalizer here, I'm pushing some of the bottom in. So it could be, as I'm going to my mix, that I like what it's doing here as far as pumping up, but I might be adding just a little too much sub. Let me listen to it with this on, and I'm going to go back to my Lindell. So yeah, there is something about me doing the 70 hertz shelf that's kind of nice if I'm just listening to it soloed. And then if I listen to it with the whole track, right? So there could be something to me that sounds a little cleaner by running it at 70 versus 45. And that might be a choice that I make as I get more into the polishing part of my mixing. So that's all the different things I did there. And now the other component is this. Right now what I've been doing is playing this at a really loud level. The level that I ended up picking for the bass was like -12 versus -3. I'm going to keep that Lindell open to kind of play with this 45 shelf, 70 shelf thing. So this is the way it should sound in the mix during this section. Right? So this is an important point that I want to make here. So when I have it back at a level that is my mix level for bass, I can hear the sub when I've got it pumped up and say, I might like that, I might like that. But when I listen to it in context of where it should be in the mix, the 45 shelf feels a little better to me for right now than the 70 shelf. The reason it does, the 70 is a lot cleaner. There's not so much of that bottom coming through. But energy-wise, it feels a little less. It doesn't quite feel the way I'm imagining I want the groove to feel. The 45 shelf feels a little better to me. And it could be that it's going to be neither of these. It could be that the Lindell is not the choice because these are set frequencies, right? It could be I need to go and create a shelf on the fab filter that's much more surgical, where I could just disable this shelf on the low end and then go into the fab filter and add a shelf wherever I want. I could say 50 hertz or I could say 60 hertz and put it whatever, or 60.232 hertz. I can pick a specific frequency for where I want the shelf to be and just slide it around until it gets to the sweet spot. All these tools are different. I could also do a similar thing in the neutron plug where I can be very surgical as far as the frequency. So there's pluses and minuses to whichever way you go. The benefit of using this simulation of a Neve console strip is there's a certain way things sound on Neve that are really pleasant, and it's a matter of personal choice of what you like. So it could be I can completely live with the notch of 45 shelf or 70 shelf with this Lindell, because that just overall sounds a little better to me than if I went surgical and said, no, I want it to be a 50 hertz shelf and fab filter. So that's the thing I'd like to point out there. So that's all the tweaking I think I've done on electric bass on this particular tune. But I wanted to make sure you guys saw some of the comping side of things, because that's an area that I haven't seen a lot of videos on other folks' YouTube channels. And it is an important part of this process is how do you record something? You could just get one or two takes and just pick which one you like. And that's in some ways a lot easier. Or you can do comping, which allows you to get more surgical and more specific, or it gives you some choices depending on what your different tracks are that you have to work with when you're doing a comp. I just think it's all super valuable. So that's everything on this video. Next video, I'm going to focus on more of the electric guitar components, and then later down the road, I'm going to get into the keyboards and then the other instruments as we move through this series. Thanks for watching, and if you're interested, please subscribe to the channel or hit the like button. All that stuff is helpful. All right, take care.